So I will be speaking today on Anthony Howell article. Well, it's not an article; it's his book, but it's Chapter 9: Transference, Substitution, and Reversal, which is page 135 to 148. So this chapter is all about transference, substitution, and reversal, but I believe that his main focus, Anthony Howell's main focus, is in transference and kind of subsets reversal and substitution into those two categories, or at least relates them back to them. Excuse me. And so he starts talking, he begins with the definition of transference in terms of psychology, psychoanalysis. And so transference is the redirection of attitudes and emotions towards a substitute. So that was on page 135. And then in terms of that, it means that occurs when a subject, which is an analysand, I believe that's how you say it, and it redirects feelings away from someone who matters to them, such as a parent, and towards their analyst, which is what we call the performer witness in performance art as the audience. So instead of calling them audience, he likes to call them performer witness. And the subject in our case is the performance art, and that's all on page 135. So Howell goes on to kind of talk about substitution really briefly on 136, about how the key to any substitution is the resemblance between original and substitute object. That's page 136. He has this whole thing where he talks about Freud having this client, or I don't know if it's a client or I think it's a client, but it's just some guy that he talks about. It's not just some guy, but somebody he talks about, that it kind of basically goes on to talk about how bizarre he is and how he did these things that made him bizarre, and that however physical our actions, they will always stir some emotional response in our audience. That's on page 136 as well. Okay, so then he goes on to talk about regression a little bit, and that's stunting growth and fear of hazard ahead. That's 137. And then he finally goes on to performance transference. And there's 11 things that he talks about when it comes to that. So I will just name the list of things that he talks about. The first is transference of action, which is the objects can be used in more than one way. That's on 137, which is also known as transference of use. Then there's transference of scale, transference of lead. I don't know if that's lead or lead. I think it's lead because he talks about couples and mirroring a lot. That's on page 137 to 38. Then there's transference from action to sign, or vice versa, sign to action. There's transference from action to language, transference of place, or transferences of place, transferences of dimension, transferences of element. Then there's humanization of an object, which I believe is a type of substitution as well. Transferences of weight, and transferences of exertion. So there's a lot of ways you can perform it, and he gives examples from all of them. He goes more on about transferences of lead. He talks about a lot, and about how lead transference is better done in couples, and talks a lot about the idea of mirroring as well, which I also didn't quite understand. I think the most interesting, in my opinion, is the transferences of element, because it was the idea of using the element, any type of element. So in the pool, he talks about, I think that's interesting. But then there's also the humanization of object, where a performer substituted for object, or the objectification of a performer, or the object invested with human qualities, personification kind of, in literary terms. So yeah. And then on to reversals. He talks about reversals on page 144 more so, and talks about how reversals play a role in performance and psychoanalysis. He says that on 144. And then he talks about transference to reversal, and then reversing messages of actions. In that the secret of reversal lies with the other. So I still am not totally understanding what reversal is, I believe, because what I'm thinking that reversal is that, like, it's almost like taking back what you're saying, kind of. Like, the idea of, okay, so he talks about actions like stamping on a foot, and then it meaning you being cordial or in your message. That was what I was having a struggle with most. And then he talks about regression again, where he's talking about the idea of regressing back in, again, that's kind of in psychoanalysis terms, that has to do with childhood mostly, or regressing back to childlike behaviors. And then he talks about the idea of the time span for a performance is a microcosm model for a life. He says that on 146. And then in performance terms, that regression is like reduplicating the start. He says that on 146 as well. And then the last thing he talks about is transference from internal formulation. And I didn't quite understand what he was talking about there either. But it was the idea of thinking by performing instead of thinking prior to performance was one of the ideas of it, which was on page 146 as well. And yeah, so I haven't really quite understood that idea of where he talks about writing and not having to think, basically, and just letting your hand think for you. So yeah, all in all, this was a very transference-based article, and he really loves Freud and not quite sure why. So yeah.